The glorious army of Bretonnia, an honourable, noble, shining lance of pure righteousness and holy wrath, a shining beacon of righteous fire to hold off the dark, only slightly besmirched by occasional filthy peasant leavings. The Bretonnian army works, well, you might begin comparing it to the feudal armies of medieval Europe, but that's not quite how it works. While in feudal times the knight was certainly the hammer blow that more often than not won the battle, and whoever had more knights was certainly at considerable advantage, in Warhammer, well, you're usually not fighting a feudal army. The closest you get is fighting the Empire, and, well, the Empire is closer to a Renaissance force than a feudal army, which means that you've got to deal with things that are considerably more of a danger to knights than filthy peasants, as the Empire sports all manner of tools that are just perfect for killing knights: handguns, crossbows, halberds, lances, cannons, mortars, steam tanks, and all manners of horrible things that even the finest plate armor is going to have some issues protecting against. And if you're not fighting the Empire, well, you might be fighting orcs, beastmen, undead, chaos, etc., etc. The baseline is that the Warhammer universe is a hell of a lot more brutal than our own medieval period. And as such, the Knights of Bretonnia have to, well, adapt. While in our period, the peasants were often the backbone of the army simply because there weren't enough knights, in Bretonnian society that's not that much of a problem because, well, it is a society based on the principles of chivalry and nobility, and every single noble is a knight, which lets them use extremely cavalry-heavy tactics, and this is represented in the tabletop by the fact that a unit of Knights of the Realm, the basic knight units, is required in your army. You can't have a Bretonnian army without one unit of Knights of the Realm. And they also have access to a special formation, the Lance formation, which allows the knights to take up what is essentially a wedge formation, allowing more of the knights to fight on the charge than would normally be possible with a standard line formation. And this is quite vital because Bretonnian knights do rely on breaking the enemy on the charge. Imperial knights have a little bit of leeway because they have slightly better armor. They're a little bit better in melee. They can grind it out. You still want to be breaking the enemy on the charge, of course, but you have the option of engaging in a bit of a grinding match. The Bretonnians don't really have this option, because while in an Empire army you might have 1 or 2 units of heavy knights in tabletop, which is already going to be costing quite a lot of points, with a Bretonnian army the majority of your troops are going to be knights, and as such you have a very limited amount of troops total, so any unit that gets bogged down in protected melee is going to be surrounded and butchered. Now, this is going to require a little bit of adaptation in a total war game, because in tabletop, well, you have a fixed point cost. An army costing 3,000 points fights an army costing 3,000 points. That's not how total war games work, of course. And at the same time, you can't just simply say that, oh well, that's simple, we just make the knights really, really expensive so that the majority of your army needs to be made up of men-at-arms, because that's also not how a Bretonnian army actually works. So instead, I think the best way to solve that particular problem is to tweak the numbers a little bit. Or actually, tweak the numbers a lot, in fact. Where you have units of knights that are slightly larger than the standard heavy cavalry, so if the standard heavy cavalry is 60 models, Bretonnian knights would be 80 models, because, well, they're Bretonnian knights. There's more of them, and it's more of a widespread tradition, so to say, or in fact a duty. And then, of course, you give them the lance formation as a special ability. Now, I do not think that the use of the wedge formation should be a purely Bretonnian thing, because, well, Imperial knightly orders have been around for quite a while, and they should most certainly be allowed to adopt a basic wedge formation, because, well, it's relatively simple. And that should give them a bit of a charge bonus, but a minus to their melee power, which means that you could employ Imperial Knights as a charging unit, hoping to break the enemy on the charge, but you risk their ability in melee combat. The Bretonnian, however, should have access to the lance formation, which is a thinner, longer wedge formation, with a greatly increased charge potential, but without a massive decrease to their melee potential. In short, they should be able to hit like an absolute hammer, but they should not be punished too much for it. They should have a small minus in their melee potential, simply because a lot of the unit is scattered and it's going to take a little bit of time for it to actually get properly arranged. But it should be a timed minus. Now, this is a gamey feature, to be sure. Like, why would the Imperial Knights have a minus while the Bretonnians haven't? Well, it's a gamey feature. It's simply there to allow the Bretonnians to actually fight like the Bretonnians would. Because if you make it so that the Bretonnians have a real hard time actually breaking an enemy unit on the charge, you're gonna have a really hard time actually making a proper Bretonnian army. And with breaking on the charge, well, I'm not saying that every single unit of Bretonnian Knights should be able to just hit an enemy unit and break them immediately. They should be able to hit them and break them within 1 or 2 minutes of impact, in most cases. Any longer, and you've got time to maneuver and probably surround the enemy. Though at the same time, if you're playing someone like the Skaven, well, you need to be able to hold for just a little bit, because that is the key to your strategy. If the Bretonnians just get frustrated and charge your wall of Skaven slaves, well, he's in for a pretty painful time. But therein lies the trouble of a Total War Warhammer game. While with just normal human cultures, balancing is relatively simple, so anything I say, of course, in my little army videos here is purely speculation. It would take quite a lot of testing and quite a lot of tweaking to actually get a working system, but I'll endeavor to give you my basic thoughts about how I think it should work and could work. We've talked about the knights and the lance, but there's also the supporting formations. Now, in tabletop, you essentially use men-at-arms as throwaway formations, which I don't really like. There's no such thing as a disposable unit in a combined arms force. And while the Bretonnians are most certainly knight-heavy, a Bretonnian army relies a surprising amount on combined arms. While the Skavens can relatively easily ignore combined arms and simply overcome the enemy with sheer weights of numbers, the Bretonnians do not have this option. In Total War, I would very much so like to see the Bretonnian army almost like a Byzantine army, where the infantry is essentially there to protect the cavalry from getting bogged down or charged. The cavalry charges out between the infantry formations to try and break the enemy army. If they fail, they retreat back behind their infantry cover and redeploy for flank charges, or, if it looks like the enemy might be broken by the infantry, prepare to charge out between the ranks of infantrymen again. Now, the charge out between ranks of infantry is probably not going to be something that would be implemented in a Bretonnian army, simply because it requires a great amount of training and coordination. Even the relatively well-trained Byzantine army had a bit of trouble pulling off a formation as complicated as splitting ranks and allowing charging cavalry to pass by in combat conditions. It is by no means an easy thing to actually pull off. And so, the completely and utterly untrained, well, the vast majority at least, men-at-arms of Bretonnia would not be able to pull this shit off in 100 years. But I think the Byzantine army would be a relatively good starting point for how the army might actually work, with the knights conducting a reconnaissance, almost, charge into the enemy lines to see if they might be able to break them early, or at least chase off a few units, and then retiring behind their protective infantry lines, with the support of trebuchets and archers to help keep the enemy at a distance while preparing for another charge. Simply because, well, in tabletop, actually retreating on purpose, so to say, is pretty damn hard. The unit needs a full turn to, realign, essentially turn around, and actually get back, which means that in actual tabletop combat conditions, it's essentially impossible. Like, you're gonna get a rear charge, guaranteed. But in real life, and in a total wargame, it is far from inconceivable to see a mass of knights hammer into the front ranks, do as much damage as possible, and then, picking their moment, disengage and withdraw behind the supporting infantry. But what tools do the Bretonnian army actually possess to pull this off? Well, as usual, we will start out with the general characters. We start out with the basic character, the Bretonnian Lord. The Bretonnian Lord is a relatively basic lord. He's nothing special. He's not a Chaos champion that excels in melee. He's not a wood elf crazy guy with a bow that fires 16 bloody arrows a turn, and he's not magical in the slightest. He does have access to a fair bit of magical equipment and special vows. And these vows are also used for the knightly units, and a Bretonnian lord may not join a unit with a vow that is higher than his own. For example, a lord with the knight's vow cannot join questing knights, because they have a vow that is more important than his. Now, the vows are the knight vow, which is the standard one available to your Knights of the Realm. It allows the unit to ignore panic from peasants who, well, that's pretty handy because they're gonna be running away at some point. Then there's the Questing Vow, which allows you to reroll failed psychology test in addition to the benefits of the Knight's Vow. Essentially, in total war terms, it would give the unit a bit of a boost to morale, but nothing special. Then there is the Grail Vow, which renders the unit immune to psychology. So it can't be frightened, terrified, or anything like that, although it might still break, but, well, with the average leadership of a Bretonnian lord, that's unlikely. And it has the rather powerful benefit, to say the least, to make all attacks made by the unit into magical attacks. Now, against most normal humans, the fact that the sword is nice and shiny and sparkly isn't actually going to affect them in all that huge a way. However, if you're attacking something that's ethereal, or in any way magical, like ghosts or banshees, for example, from the undead army list, these weapons are going to be able to cleave through them like butter. This means that a unit with the Grail Vow is just a nightmare for undead players, because not only are they ignoring one of your greatest weapons, the ability to instill fear and terror, they also just laugh at your ethereal creatures, so you can't even bog them down properly. So that's pretty damn annoying, to say the least, for any undead player. Other than that, he is a bog-standard human hero. However, he's got a special rule. A Bretonnian lord may never refuse a challenge without losing the blessing of the lady, and I'll get to the blessing in just a moment. Now, of course, this depends on whether challenges will actually be a part of a total wargame. I'd like it to, because, well, it's a part of tabletop, and there could certainly be some pretty damn cool possibilities to implement that in a total wargame, but again, it's going to require a completely new engine, so I'm not going to be speculating too much on how that might work until we have, well, any information, essentially. But, essentially, like I said, he cannot refuse a challenge, which means that he had best be kitted out for bear, because he's more than likely going to be your general, and if the enemy sends an anti-hero unit straight at him and offers a challenge, well, you might be in really, really deep shit. Though, of course, being a mere mortal, the Bretonnian Lord is definitively going to have problems with things like a Chaos Champion or a Saurus Old Blood, but he's more than capable of defending himself if kitted out with the correct magical doodads. And while he's not a particularly good combat lord when it comes to the mass destruction of enemy ranks, which means that he has a somewhat limited use as a frontline lord, because well, he's going to add more oomph and attack to the unit he joins, of course, but he's not going to add that much. Rather, you want him kitted out for big things, killing monsters or special characters, because that's where he really excels. And, well, the Bretonnian army is a little light on big bad bastard killers, so best to bear that in mind. So, the Blessing of the Lady, what is it? Well, before the battle begins, the Bretonnian player may choose to pray to the lady. Now, if the Bretonnian player was usually to take the first turn in tabletop, which of course is turn-based, then he forfeits the right to play the first turn and rather starts second. If he starts second, well, he's starting second, so he doesn't just, lose a turn. And praying for the Blessing of the Lady gives a bonus to all units and their mounts with a vow. This benefit is a +6 ward save against all sources, so on a roll of 6 on a d6 the unit ignores the wound. Or a +5 ward save against strength 5 or more attacks. So they've got a reasonable chance of bouncing a cannonball, about 25%. It's not terrible, it's not fantastic, but it certainly helps. However, the blessing is lost for the entirety of the remaining battle if the character or unit flees or a challenge is turned down in close combat. Now, as for implementation in a total wargame, that's a little problematic, simply because, well, how do you actually implement a ward save? Well, I would like it to be kind of a dice roll. Essentially, if a unit gets hit by a cannonball and he actually passes his ward save, which 25% for a ward save for an army that has very, very little anti-artillery, fair enough, I'd say. Maybe your army has to cast a spell or something, so they have to remain immobile for a minute or two to receive the blessing, something along those lines, and thereby receive a 25% ward save, which means that a cannonball, well, let's do an example. A cannonball hits a Bretonnian knight unit. The cannonball bounces through the unit and hits 5 knights, and 2 of these pass their ward saves, and so they stay alive and take no damage, while the remaining 3, well, they eat a cannonball to the face, groin, or chest, and, well, die. A reasonable solution, I think. You might actually want to up it from 25% simply because there's going to be a hell of a lot more artillery. Because the basic artillery battery in a total wargame is going to be 4 units or so, so maybe push it all the way up to 50%, but that leaves some problems because, well, then you're really starting to get dice rolly, so I'm not sure. Without actually testing it, I can't be certain, but a percentage-based chance to ignore high damage stuff is reasonable, I think. As for the 6+ universal ward save, I think that should be limited to ranged weapons only, so it has a slightly higher than 6+, 10-15% chance of ignoring arrow damage or crossbow. Maybe it should only be armor-piercing stuff, so if they get shot up by a crossbow, for example, they've got a percentage chance of ignoring the hit, although relatively low. it's really hard to say without actually testing it, so yeah, for the moment I think we'll go with 25% against cannonballs, 10-15% chance against armor-piercing attacks. Moving on, we have the Prophetess of the Lady. The Prophetess is your basic Lord level caster, which means she is a level 4 mage. She should be ridiculously heavily protected, but she's, well, flat out, Bretonnia is not High Elves or Tzeentch or Lizardmen. They are extremely limited when it comes to magical artillery. However, prophetesses and damsels are pretty damn cheap as far as magic casters go, which allows them to put up a really powerful magical defense with lots of beneficial buff spells and the ability to dispel a lot of incoming magic. Now, again, magic, we don't know how it works, so I'll try to keep it brief, but essentially, the prophetess and the damsel are defensive mages. They do have some offensive spells, but they are very, very circumstantial, although they can be devastating if used correctly. But they usually require the presence of some on-map terrain like a hill or a forest or these kinds of things. Essentially, they might cause the forest to spring into life and attack the unit inside it, for example, that kind of stuff. But they're primarily defensive mages, and they're supposed to be, because, well, you need to get your expensive and powerful knights into combat with the enemy, and they're going to struggle to do so if they're getting pelted with fireballs every step of the way. Which is why, while not that destructive, magic is a very key part of a Bretonnian army, because you need to keep your expensive units alive, because, well, it's pretty much all melee, so you've got to expect to have to walk through some pretty serious firepower to get them stuck in. Now, as I mentioned, the Prophetess also comes in a cheaper variant called the Damsel of the Lady. And interestingly enough, while in most melee combat-y armies, which the Bretonnians are, you would want to put something like a Bretonnian lord or a close combat hero in your lances, but the Bretonnians actually benefit quite a lot from having a Damsel of the Lady in their frontline charging lance units, simply because she offers a ton of magical protection, which again is completely vital to get the most out of a Bretonnian army. And, of course, unlike combat characters, a damsel must not be placed in the front ranks of a combat unit. She can be tucked away quite safely in the rear, where she can protect her fellow Bretonnians with defensive magic, buffs, and the occasional healing. I would kinda like to see the Damsel of the Lady not as a hero, but as an attachment to the unit, so kinda like Skaven weapons teams or Imperial Free Company troops. You buy an upgrade, and that lets the unit have Damsel of the Lady, because damsels are pretty damn common. Now, of course, they shouldn't be allowed to be proper spellcasters while they're being attachments, but maybe an increase to their ward save, maybe some basic abilities like every unit that has a damsel gets to activate a shield, for example, that reduces incoming range damage. Something like that. Could be interesting. And then you keep the prophetesses of the lady for various levels to be your proper spellcasters. The last of the heroes, you have the paladin, and you are required to have at least one paladin to act as the battle standard bearer. Now, the required thing, well, in Total War games you're always required to have a general, so basically you just say that the paladin accompanies your characters. That's what I would prefer. I'd like for you to be able to recruit them as heroes, but kind of, I have to say I'd like to see them as attachments like the damsels. You have a choice, you buy a damsel or you buy a paladin. And the paladin is essentially a bigger, badder knight. That adds quite a lot of oomph to a Bretonnian knight unit, but you're sacrificing the protection that a damsel might offer. Maybe you could kit him out a little bit, but if he is to be an upgrade, which I really would kind of like, just have him be a special little hero character within your units, not particularly powerful, you know, but an upgrade. He's essentially the chosen champion of whatever unit of knights you're commanding. I feel that would be a really cool system, and it would add a bit of flavor to the Bretonnians. They always have a champion in their units, because, well, they're knights, so they have the cream of the crop at the head of the lance, so to say. I think that would be pretty cool. Now, it would limit the amount of heroes you have for Bretonnia, but I think that's correct, because a prophetess of the lady, in fluff, could never actually be given command of an army because, well, she's just a mere woman, snuff snuff. And so she can't possibly have any idea how to fight, you know, all that wonderfulness. So I'd kinda be fine with just having your general be a Bretonnian lord, and then you can have a little bit of flavor in what unit you pick him in. So yeah, I'd like that system, but I don't know. It's definitely a system that would be open for interpretation. Now, the Bretonnians have quite a bit of importance when it comes to their mounts, because, well, they can take vows. Of course, you've got the standard Bretonnian warhorse, which is, well, it's a horse. But then you've also got the Royal Pegasus, which is available in considerable numbers to Bretonnian nobles, which allows you to get a really damn nice mobile lord. Of course, you're giving up on his powers as a combat unit unless you place him in a unit of Pegasus Knights. You could have an extremely mobile general to zip across the battlefield with his high leadership and, you know, just keeping the peasants from running. But it'd be an excellent mount for a prophetess of the lady, just so she can zip around and offer her magical protection to whoever needs it most. And then you have the Hippogriff. Sadly, the Hippogriff is not a particularly good unit in tabletop because it weighs in at 200 points. Which isn't much less than the Lord himself, so it's a redonkulously expensive unit. And the Hippogriff's stat line is very mediocre for that kind of cost. And since the Hippogriff, well, you can't join a unit of knights with this thing. You might argue that it could join a unit of Pegasus Knights, but even that's iffy, which means that you now have the most important character in your army, being an extremely expensive character to boot, with the biggest target marker pointed on his head that you can possibly imagine, so he's going to be enjoying all manners of cannonballs headed his general direction. In Total War, though, that's not necessarily a problem. You could simply let the Hippogriff be a high-level upgrade, so that when your Bretonnian lord reaches a certain level, he gets to ride a Hippogriff, and you allow the Hippogriff to be integrated into Pegasus Knights, for example. At least in that way, you avoid the absurd cost, but even then, since the Hippogriff isn't that fantastic in melee combat, it's a little bit of an iffy unit. But it's certainly a cool unit, so there must be some way to make it work in a Total War game. I think just simply buffing its stat line a little bit and allowing it to join units of Pegasus Knight would help a lot with making it at least relatively competitive. Moving on from the heroes, we have the core units. And as is only fitting for a Bretonnian army, the first core unit is the Knights of the Realm. The Knights of the Realm are essentially the minor nobility and, well, essentially any land-owning knights. A knight has to basically get himself a little bit of fame, a little bit of fortune, gotta do a few cool things, so to say, to be elevated into a Knight of the Realm, as they all start out as knights-errants. As such, these are pretty veteran knights, well-equipped, well-armed, and with the potential of getting the blessing of the lady, and, crucially, they completely ignore your peasants running screaming past them, and they've got a pretty high morale to boost. They are your standard sledgehammer force. They are meant to charge the enemy en masse and break him, and if they can't break him, they retreat and try again. The Knights of Bretonnia are not like the Knights of the Empire, who are more than happy to stay in grueling melee and simply outmatch the enemy with their fantastic armor and brutal swordsmanship. Now, this is not the way of a Bretonnian knight. A Bretonnian knight does not lower himself to such muddy melee. He charges the enemy, lance lowered, and he breaks his enemy. As such, in a Total War game, I would say that they should have a really high charge statistic, of course. They are lancers, after all, with a reasonable armor save and a decent melee combat stat, because, you know, they are knights. And with reasonable numbers of, I'd say, 80. Now, in a straight-up fight with Empire-heavy cavalry, they'll do a hell of a lot of damage on the charge, but if they stay in melee combat, the Imperial Knights are going to win. Which is why the Knights of the Realm very much so rely on a bit of a hit-and-run tactic. The Knights of the Realm should be used as the sledgehammer unit they are, and the lowly peasants should be there to make sure that if the charge didn't break the enemy, that the knights are free to disengage and try again. All in all, they're a damn fine unit, but they do require a little bit of tactical finesse, because if they get bogged down, or heavens forbid if they get flanked or surrounded, hindering them from breaking off and attempting to charge again, they're just not going to last very long, especially not against particularly savage opponents like orcs or something like that. Below them, you have the Knights Errant. All knights start out as knights errants, and have to complete some feat of arms to be awarded their spurs, so to say, and be elevated to full knighthood, and therefore being allowed to fight with the Knights of the Realm. This eagerness to prove themselves means that they're just a little bit, headstrong, shall we say. But this impetuous nature is little comfort for the enemy, who gets a solid wall of heavy knights hammering into him. And they have much the same stat lines as Knights of the Realm, armed with lances and work in pretty much exactly the same way. The problem is that while Knights of the Realm have long since figured out that their role as a sledgehammer unit sometimes requires them to retreat and try again, the Knights Errants, well, they haven't quite gotten that lesson just yet. And as such, they should have a little bit of a special rule. They might charge without orders, but the real drawback is that they might not withdraw when ordered, which leaves them open to the possibility of getting surrounded and butchered. As for availability, well, they should be relatively cheap. Knights Errant should be available from essentially your basic army building, and Knights of the Realm should be available from your second or maybe, second level army building sounds good. So they should be relatively quick and, for knights, relatively cheap to produce. You should be able to have armies which are at least halfway made up of knights without too much problem. Though the Knights of the Realm should be considerably more expensive, so that you're gonna have to ask yourself, do I want to employ the cheaper and potentially more cost-effective Knights Errants, but risk their special rule and that I might not be able to control them when I really need to, or do I go for the more expensive, more reliable Knights of the Realm? And then, for the supporting units, you have the Men-at-Arms. And, well, the Men-at-Arms are pretty damn terrible. They have one benefit, and that is the fact that they can use the leadership of any nearby unit of knights. It doesn't have to be the general, doesn't have to be a special character. Any unit of knights will suffice. And, of course, when they do run away, well, the rest of your knights aren't really going to care much, so it's not a problem. Their job is much the same as that of Skaven slaves, to be honest. They're there to be a bit of a meat shield grindy unit, and to make sure that your knights do not get charged while they're reforming after their original sally out. However, they don't only fulfill much the same role as Skaven slaves, they're practically Skaven slaves. Empire state troops will chew through these guys, straight up. Skaven clan rats will chew through them. Pretty much anything will actually chew through men-at-arms if given enough time. And don't even get me started on Chaos Warriors or anything. They're not gonna hold for long, but they might hold long enough, and therein lies the key. You don't need your men-at-arms to hold the line indefinitely. You merely need them to rout slowly enough for your knights to reform, either behind them or on the flanks, to charge off and finish off any enemies they couldn't chase off on the first go-around. And this is why I would like to see men-at-arms come in units of 240, full-on horde size, because they're terribly equipped. The men-at-arms are given practically no training, and their equipment is shoddy in the extreme. Even orcs would consider some of the equipment given to men-at-arms to be just a little bit disgraceful. And they haven't the faintest clue about units' tactics. As I said, if men-at-arms are trained at all, they are trained in individual fighting. They are given basic drills. They are quite literally peasants handed pitchforks as far as their combat experience goes, so they are a very, very, very bad unit, but they're kinda supposed to be. However, you do have a not so bad unit, in fact, in the peasant bowmen, because here the name is slightly misleading. Again, they might be peasants, but they use longbows. And much like their real-life English counterparts, they train with these bows from a very early age. And quite a lot of Bretonnian peasants, or peasant families more like, actually do get themselves a bow. Now, again, Bretonnian peasants ridiculously poor, to the point that most families can only afford one bow, and even that's going to require a bit of saving. So the longbows are often passed down through the generations, and are taken care of as one of the family's most prized possessions. Because the longbow allows a peasant that knows how to use it some serious advantages over a peasant that doesn't. First and foremost, if he is allowed to hunt, well, he can hunt. Now, the local lord will pretty much never allow mere peasants to hunt proper game in his forest, or if he does, he allows him to hunt the game for his liege lord. But on occasion, he will allow these hunters to hunt smaller game, rabbits, that kind of stuff, and he sometimes, and again sometimes, because in the mind of a lord, a peasant that is given the task of hunting a deer should be only too grateful that he is even allowed to hunt the deer and bring it to his lord without doing something so horrendously impolite as asking for payment. Ugh, those filthy peasants. But occasionally, the Lord will pay him, and with pay him, I mean he'll give him a single copper or something along those lines, but still, better than nothing. However, the bow has one major advantage. The simple fact that a longbowman is capable of defending himself. If a longbowman is recruited into the army, he's relatively safe in the back lines. He can fire away at the enemy, he can earn his handful of coins and pay in relative safety, and he's paid slightly better than the men-at-arms, because while the men-at-arms are, well, chaff, essentially, the peasant bowman is, while not maybe a trained professional, he is at least proficient in the use of his longbow, and is therefore worth an additional half a copper or some other very, very generous payment. But in tabletop and in Total War, he's quite a bit more powerful, because, well, these are longbows, which means they're a considerable threat even to heavily armored knights. And they're pretty damn cheap and come with a couple of really interesting special rules. The first, and probably the biggest, is the fact that they have access to defensive stakes, which gives them a considerable amount of protection against the cavalry that would normally be the bane of their existence. And they can also be given braziers, which allows them to use flaming attacks. And flaming arrows is actually fairly rare in the Warhammer world, simply because, unlike in Total War games, where every single archer is expected to carry around a lighter or something that allows him to light his arrows on fire, in Warhammer, well, they take a little bit more realistic an approach. You can't have fire arrows without fire, and you can't have fire without, well, something to burn. And so a simple torch or something probably isn't going to do, and every single archer simply isn't going to be carrying a torch, because, you know, he needs two hands to even operate his weapon. The brazier, however, is essentially placed out in front of the unit and allows them to light their arrows on fire and thereby use fire arrows. Which, in a Total War game, not that big of a deal, you know, it's just fire arrows, it does a little bit of morale damage and all of that funkiness. But in Warhammer, again, fire is considerably more effective, because there's a hell of a lot more monsters in Warhammer than in Total War, and quite a few of these monsters either have regeneration, which is of course stopped by fire, or they are flammable. For example, tree men or mummies are both flammable, and therefore take an absolute ton of damage from fire arrows. And this really does mean that peasant bowmen with defensive stakes and braziers is one of the most cost-effective archer units in the game, surprisingly enough. And they're actually excellent protective units for your trebuchets. So, as the French learned at Agincourt, you should never, ever underestimate peasant bowmen. So, how would they actually work in Total War with the rest of the army? Well, they are your protective unit. They will be able to outshoot quite a lot of ranged units with their longbows. They'll certainly outrange quite a few ranged units. Of course, they're not going to be outranging Jezails or anything batshit insane like that, but they'll definitively give Empire skirmish archers or crossbowmen a proper run for their money. Though their light to non-existent armor means that they do need to use that range. If they start getting pelted by return fire, yeah, they're in pretty deep shit, and of course, you're not going to be out shooting wood elves anytime soon. But they are excellent supporting units, and the simple fact that they are longbows means that they are a considerable threat to heavily armored opponents and monsters. However, they are peasants, wearing no armor, and so they need to be protected, which is the problem because, well, all the units in your army that aren't knights should be protecting the knights, so every unit of peasant bowmen you take, while excellent archers, means that you have to take one unit less of Knights of the Realm or men-at-arms. So again, you have a really cool trade-off there. Do you weaken your front line and risk your knights getting caught unprepared while reforming for a little bit of extra range damage, or maybe you sacrifice a unit of knights, reasoning that, well, if I can inflict more range damage, it'll be easier for my knights to break them, you know? That's the kind of cool little choices you might have to make in a Total War Warhammer game. Moving on, we have the special units, starting out with the Questing Knights. The Questing Knights are, well, knights that have embarked upon some sort of special quest, usually to gain the favor of the Lady of the Lake and thereby become Grail Knights. The Questing Knights is a very interesting unit in a Bretonnian army because it's not a charge unit. Because, well, they use great weapons. Now, they can still benefit from the Blessing of the Lady, of course, and while, if you have the chance, of course you should charge, but they are a unit that can actually stand and fight it out in melee combat, because, well, they hit like absolute goddamn trucks. and the fact that they get to reroll Fear and Terror due to the questing Knight vow means that they are a perfect unit for those units that you just can't break but you need to grind out. For example, if you charge a unit of Empire or Heavy Cavalry in the front with your Knight, you cause a ton of damage, but now you can't disengage because, well, the enemy is cavalry too, so they're gonna follow you, and they will outgrind you. Well, send in the questing Knights and withdraw the normal Knights, and voila. And they also, of course, make for the absolute perfect flank guards, because they are going to be out-fighting most other heavy cavalry. Now, in a straight-up fight against Empire Heavy Knights, actually not sure who would win. The Empire Heavy Knights would cause an absolute batshit insane amount of damage on the charge with lances and everything, but they'd definitely be losing in the long run in melee, although it would be close, so I'm not entirely sure. But seeing as they're immune to Fear and Terror, well, they can stop big bad scary things from running you down from the flanks and chasing off your peasants. And they have a little bit of a special rule. The fact that even though they have two-handed weapons, they are still counted as having shields as far as shooting attacks go. So it's not actually that easy to just chase them off with a bit of missile fire. And they should also weigh in at 80 men, in my opinion, because while they are rare, the Knights of the Realm, yes, I think that their limited role will already make sure that they are seen as fair as a considerably rarer unit, and they should be recruitable, in my opinion, at tier 3 or something like that military buildings. Then we've got the Pegasus Knights, which are, again, knights riding Pegasuses, obviously. Now, of course, being knights riding Pegasuses, they are stupendously expensive. For an equal point cost of 4 of these bastards, you can get a Lord-level character mounted on a hippogriff. So they should be astonishingly expensive and rare, to the point where I'd kinda like to see them as a quest reward or something that gets unlocked during an event or something along the lines of that. If they are to be recruitable, they should be stupendously expensive, and their upkeep ought to be astronomical because, well, Pegasus Knights, rare, very rare. Though they're not as rare as to be limited in their numbers, though, in my opinion. They should be very much so a big, bad sledgehammer unit. You know, actually, when I think about it, maybe you should be able to recruit them when your general reaches a certain level. That could be a cool mechanic, actually. And they should be relatively large units, considering the fact that they're monstrous cavalry. Now, the monstrous cavalry, yes, but they're just Pegasuses. It's not like they're riding demigryphs or something, so maybe 30 to 40, something along those lines. They should definitely be a pretty damn good anti-monster unit because, well, the amount of power you get behind a lance while riding a war horse is incredible. The amount of power you get behind a lance riding a flying horse, well, let's just say that if you hit an ogre with that, the ogre's gonna be very, very dead indeed. And of course, seeing as they will be swoop attacking, essentially, they have a ton of charge damage. I think they are the sledgehammer amongst sledgehammer units. Fast, hard-hitting, well-protected, and stupendously expensive. And they can also take the blessing of the lady, so ward saves. Yippee! Now, of course, we always get back to the question of how to balance flying units, but if you allow this unit not to fly, technically, but, you know, jump, so they get a little flying charge, for example, and can't just jump over enemy units, I think that would work pretty damn well for the Pegasus Knights, and give them a bit of a disengage ability on a considerable cooldown, of course. Then onto something a lot more basic. You have the Mounted Yeomen. Now, these are essentially the squires of your knights. the few peasants favored enough to be given horses. Of course, they don't own the horses because God forbid, but at least they get to ride something, which is a rarity in Bretonnia. And they are the basic skirmish cavalry of the Bretonnian army. Now, they're quite common and fill a very important role within the Bretonnian army, but they don't pack much in the way of armor. And unless upgraded, they don't have shields either, so they'd be extremely vulnerable to shooting, and again, being very, very light cavalry, primarily utilized as a supporting unit. I'm tempted to say they should come in standard infantry size of about 120, because any unit of heavy cavalry that catches these guys is going to just stomp all over them, and even most elite light cavalry unit of 80 members or so are probably going to beat them. And they're gonna fall like flies to any kind of concentrated firepower, so I'd kinda like them to be 120. You use them as kind of a light screen for your knights, you use them as flanking units to hit enemies already engaged, you use them as quick hit and run units to keep the enemy busy, and you use their ranged attack to do a little bit of damage here and there. Yeah. Could be an interesting unit, and of course should be available in as huge a number as you choose. They should be pretty goddamn cheap. And there's certainly some potential symmetry, because while Knights of the Realm and other heavier knights are pretty damn slow, the mounted yeomen are not, and so they can be a really good supporting unit, hovering just outside the range of enemy range units, and darting in to support the charge of their betters before darting back out of range again. A final of the special units, we have the Grail Reliquae. Now, this is an odd unit. Essentially, it's a shrine to a dead Grail Knight surrounded by a bunch of batshit insane peasants that have decided to start worshipping said dead Grail Knight. And, well, if men-at-arms were bad, the guys defending the Grail Reliquae are worse. Their only advantage is the fact that they're stubborn, so they can be quite hard to break, but they're not going to be inflicting, well, much in the way of damage. To the point where in Total War I'd consider this a bit of a useless unit, so rather than just having it be a stubborn kind of blocking unit, I'd like to see the Grail Reliquae be taken away from the Chaorazi little peasants and be given to the men-at-arms as an upgrade, where it's a Grail Reliquae, it's a dead saint, so to say, and essentially it will count as a unit of knights for leadership purposes. So all men-at-arms within a certain radius of the Grail Reliquae will be able to use its leadership, that of a Grail Knight, which is high as all hell, for their leadership test. And in Total War terms, of course, that simply means that they get a massive bonus to their morale, which I think would make it a much more interesting unit. For the two final units, we have one of the most cost-effective units in the Bretonnian army, and also the most un-Bretonnian, the Field Trebuchet. The Trebuchet is the Bretonnian army's answer to large angry monsters along the lines of bloodthirsters and dragons and that kind of stuff, and large blocks of extremely heavily armored enemy infantry. Think Chaos Warriors and the like. Because no matter how heavily armored you are, a big-ass rock being flung at you from extreme range is going to hurt. They should come in standard artillery sizes of 4, and should be pretty accurate with relatively long range, well, if not extremely long range, because trebuchets were very, very long-ranged weapons, and pretty accurate to boot, everything considering. They should be a key part of any Bretonnian army, really, able to soften up the enemy so that your knights might break them more reliably, and take care of high morale elite units that your knights are going to struggle with. And of course, to deal with enemy super heavy cavalry along the lines of Blood Crushers or Rhinox Riders, stuff like that even your Bretonnian knights are gonna hesitate about charging. And then for the last unit, you have the hammer of all hammers, the Bretonnian Grail Knights. These guys are questing knights that have fulfilled their quest and drunk from the Holy Grail, becoming essentially demigods. And as befits their new standard, they are ridiculously powerful. They have an even better charge than your average Knight of the Realms, and they can fight it out in melee too with no issues. They are probably the heaviest purely human cavalry in the game, and they'll even give Blood Dragon vampires a run for their money. However, as with all such ridiculously powerful unit, you've got a couple of drawbacks that you've got to give them in a total wargame. First of all is the simple fact that they are ridiculously rare, to the point where this should be one of those units only given through quests, or as special rewards for doing long quest lines, as they are questing knights. Or alternatively, maybe you could be allowed to upgrade a unit of questing knights into Grail Knights, but it would require a stupendous level of experience. They'd need to be like triple gold chevrons or something like that, or triple silver at the very least. But if you do get your hands on them, well, they should be your premier hammer unit, sent straight down the enemy's throat to break his biggest, baddest, most important units, or sent against particularly scary monsters and the like, because, well, these guys will deal with pretty much anything put in front of them. Although, like all heavy cavalry, you do want them to be charging, so even though they are ridiculously good in a fight, don't let them get caught flat-footed by other super heavy cavalry. And that pretty much wraps it up for the Bretonnian army. I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.